Before we get started, I have Roy Miller, your hand's up. Did you want to do a sound check before we start?
I do, thank you.
Yeah, we can hear you just fine, Roy. Thank you.
Great, thanks.
Okay, welcome back from lunch. Now that the boss is back, coming down the aisle here, we can go ahead and get started. As I mentioned before the break, we're going to turn this afternoon to considering specifications for Scop and black sea bass. And then later this afternoon, there is a board-only action when I'll turn the floor over to Justin Davis, who's my co-chair today, as we are meeting jointly with the Mid-Atlantic Council and the Atlantic States Marine Fisheries Commission's Summer Flounder, Scop, and Black Sea Bass Board. Today, we're going to start with the Scop 2023 specifications. We have Hannah Hart from Council staff who's going to provide us with the presentation. And if you're ready, Hannah, you can go ahead and get started.
Great, thank you, Mr. Chair, and good afternoon, everyone. So just like for summer flounder, we'll review Scop specifications for 2023. So just a quick overview. During the presentation, we'll go over the Scop stock status, the Northeast Fisheries Science Center data update. We'll review recent catch and landings and the summary of the advisor feedback provided for the fishery performance report. Then we'll go into the SSC recommendation and the monitoring committee recommendation. And just like for summer flounder, the objectives for today is for the council and board to recommend Scop catch and landing limits for 2023. And if you so desire, any recommended changes for commercial management measures for the upcoming fishing year. So in 2021, the Northeast Fisheries Science Center provided a Scop management track stock assessment, which used data through 2019. The assessment found that the stock was not overfished and overfishing was not occurring in 2019. And the table on this slide outlines the updated reference points. And as you can see, spawning stock biomass was about 2 times greater than the target, and fishing mortality was about 32% below the threshold level. So the next 2 slides are graphs pulled directly from the assessment. On this slide, spawning stock biomass is represented by the solid black line. The SSB target is represented by the black dashed horizontal line, and recruitment is the solid blue bars. Some of the key takeaways here is that SSB in the past several years has been well above the target, and as mentioned on the previous slide, in 2019 was about 2 times greater. However, in recent years, spawning stock biomass does show a declining trend, and 2019 recruitment was the lowest of the time series, and since 2017, recruitment has been below average. Given this, biomass is projected to continue to decline. So the graph here shows total catch in blue and fishing mortality in the solid black squares. Total catch has shown an increasing trend since the 1990s, while fishing mortality has remained relatively constant and below that threshold level. So that's that dashed horizontal line since about 2001. And as mentioned on the initial stock status slide, fishing mortality is about 32% below that threshold in 2019. So in addition to the management track assessment that was used to set measures last year, this year the Northeast Science Center provided a data update that includes information through spring of 2022. Just to highlight some of the details provided in the full report, the figure shown here represents Scop biomass indices from the center's spring and fall bottom trawl survey. And if you look at the fall 2015 and spring 2016 biomass indices, these years represent record highs of the time series, but since then, both seasonal indices have generally decreased. The most recent indices for spring 2022 and fall 2021 do, however, show an increase compared to 2019, and the spring index increased by about 34% and the fall index by about 132%. Lastly, the fall survey indices also suggest that we had a very large year class recruit to the stock in 2015, but since then we've seen below average recruitment. So now transitioning into 2021 fishery information, the graph shows commercial and recreational catch, including both landings through 2021 and dead discards through 2019. Commercial landings shown by the solid blue line have generally declined since 2012, and in 2021, landings decreased by about 0.6 million pounds compared to 2020. while commercial dead discards, which is that dashed blue line, have generally increased since 2012 with a peak in 2017. And that peak in discards in 2017 is likely due to that strong recruitment class we saw in 2015. As for recreational landings, the solid black line have generally increased since 2012. And in 2021, there was a 3.71 million pound increase compared to 2020. Since 2012, recreational dead discards have remained relatively constant, but like commercial, we do see that peak again in 2017. However, it's not as drastic. So there's a more detailed version of this table in the staff memo, but this table shows recreational fishery performance relative to catch and landing limits. And as shown in the 5th column, which is the RHL overage and underage column, recreational landings were below the RHL each year up until 2020. In 2020, which was the first year that those new MRIP estimates were used for RHL evaluation, the RHL was exceeded by 98%, and again in 2021 by 174%. However, looking at the last column, the ACL was only exceeded once in the past 10 years, in 2017, by about 1%. And this ACL overage was entirely driven by that peak in dead discards seen that year, as shown on the previous slide. Given dead discards are not yet available for 2020 or 2021, we cannot determine if the ACL was officially exceeded in those years, but just by looking at landings for those years compared to the ACLs, we can determine that ACL overages are likely. So similar to the previous table, this shows commercial fishery performance relative to limits. As you can see, the commercial sector has not fully landed their quota over the past several years, and harvests range from 16 to 47% below the quotas. However, in 2017, like recreational, the commercial ACL was exceeded by about 17%, and similarly, this overage was driven by those unusually high discards. Looking at landings for 2020 and 2021 for the commercial sector, we can assume ACL overages were unlikely, but again, this is not official yet since dead discards aren't available. So the figure on this slide is pulled directly from the GARFO quota monitoring website and shows preliminary commercial landings by quota period for 2022 in blue compared to the previous years in yellow. And as you can see, preliminary 2022 commercial landings follow a similar but slightly below trend as 2021. And we are well below the quota for each quota period. So since general fishery performance report comments for all 3 demersal species was already discussed during the summer flounder presentation, I'm going to concentrate just on Scop specific comments. So for the market and economics, advisors commented that Scop prices were generally good this winter. And in New York, prices got up to $2.50 per pound for jumbo, $1.75 per pound for large, and $1 per pound for medium grade fish. However, advisors also commented that it was a rather windy winter and commercial effort was limited by those weather conditions. Like for the 3 demersal species, most advisors expressed concern about how the increase in fuel, bait, and more will impact recreational and commercial effort. And one advisor commented that in New Jersey, Scop are not commonly found in state waters and expressed the increase in fuel prices will impact recreational effort and individuals' willingness to make the trip out into federal waters. Another advisor expressed concern on the impact of imported fish on the U.S. Scop market, and this same advisor noted the historical importance of small fish for low-income markets and recommended decreasing the commercial size limit to 6 or 7 inches to bring that market back. However, another advisor commented through email recommending no change to the commercial minimum size. Another comment made about the commercial fishery was the recommendation to modify the Southern Gear Restricted Area, or GRA, which is the green polygon on this map. This advisor voiced that Scop are not common in waters off Virginia, and he articulated that the southernmost 20 miles of the Southern GRA was only taking away fishing area from small mesh trawls and is providing no real biological benefit for Scop. As for the recreational fishery, multiple advisors voiced concern about high MRIP landing estimates and how they might be inflating overall catch estimates. One advisor was specifically concerned about 2021 Wave 2 Massachusetts estimates, and he voiced that the estimates do not accurately represent the fishery during that time of the year, and was frustrated that the estimate is based off a single intercept. He recommended working with MRIP staff to smooth out data poor scenarios like this. Another advisor also questioned why the recreational sector has been able to exceed the RHL for the past 2 years in a row. So advisors also commented on the need to better understand impacts due to wind energy development. One advisor noted that there are planned projects within the Scop migratory path and the need to better understand how noise pollution and vibrations from those structures will impact Scop biology and behavior. So now transitioning to the SSC recommendation. The SSC met at the end of July and determined that although RHL overages occurred the past few years, no evidence suggests the need to change the previously adopted 2023 ABC, which is set at 29.67 million pounds. So here's the flow chart that displays how the OFL and ABC recommendation from the SSC is then used to derive landing and catch limits for the upcoming year. For Scop, since landing limits were already catch-based, the only changes made here as a result of the commercial and recreational allocation amendment is to the percentages of the ABCs allocated to each sector. Previously, the allocation was 78% to commercial and 22% to recreational. However, the amendment modified these percentages based on updated data, which resulted in a new allocation of 65% to commercial and 35% to recreational, which is shown here in the yellow highlighted text. From ACLs, the monitoring committee can then recommend management uncertainty, which could be subtracted from the ACL to calculate sector-specific ACTs. From there, projected discards for each sector are estimated and then subtracted from the sector-specific ACTs to calculate the commercial quota and the recreational harvest limit, or RHL. The commercial quota is then divided into 3 season quota periods as prescribed in the FMP. So if we go step by step through that flow chart, annual catch limits are defined by the allocations prescribed in the FMP, and given the council and board took final action on an amendment to revise Scop allocations, which is expected to be effective of January next year, the council and board should consider updating the previously adopted 2023 ACLs to reflect those new allocation percentages. This results in a commercial ACL of about 19.29 million pounds and a recreational ACL of about 10.39 million pounds. The next step in the flow chart is to decide if a buffer for management uncertainty is warranted, and the monitoring committee considered multiple things for both commercial and recreational fishery and recommended no buffer be subtracted from the ACLs. For the commercial fishery, the quota is well monitored and we have the ability to implement in-season closures if necessary. Additionally, the full commercial quota is consistently not caught, and in the past 10 years, the ACL has only been exceeded once. Additionally, for the recreational fishery, management measures were recently put in place to reduce overall harvest and aim to prevent future RHL overages. Additionally, a monitoring committee noted that it is not yet known if the percent change approach under the harvest control rule will require more or less restrictive measures for Scop in 2023. So given these considerations, the monitoring committee recommended no management uncertainty buffer, and therefore the ACTs would equal the ACLs. So from there, estimated projected discards are subtracted from the ACTs to derive the commercial quota and RHL. Because the methodology is not prescribed in the FMP, staff looked at multiple ways to calculate projected discards for the upcoming year. However, after some discussion, the monitoring committee decided maintaining the current method would be most appropriate for the upcoming year. Under the current method, total projected landings and discards are provided by the Science Center. So this is a similar method described in the summer flounder presentation. And then those total projected discards are divided by applying a 3-year moving average proportion of dead discards by sector. So last year, the proportion of discards for each sector was calculated using discard data from 2017 to 2019. And because that remains the most recent available data, and there's been no changes to the ABC or ABC projections, this would maintain the same projected dead discards that were used for previously adopted 2022 and 2023 measures. So the table shown here outlines the monitoring committee recommended 2023 catch and landing limits compared to values previously adopted. In the far right-hand column explains the basis for each measure, and the basis for each measure is relatively the same compared to the previously adopted limits. And the only true change here is based on that allocation amendment that was agreed upon. And all changes represented in this table are in that bolded text. So as for commercial regulations, given the lengthy conversation the monitoring committee had last year in response to an industry request and the lack of new information suggesting changes, the monitoring committee recommended no changes to commercial measures for 2023. So thank you for bearing with me through that. And just a reminder, the goal of today is to adopt catch and landing limits for 2023 and to consider any changes to commercial measures as shown on the screen here. And that concludes the presentation.
Hey, Hannah. Excuse me. Thank you for the presentation. Let me look around and see if anybody has any questions for Hannah. If you have a question, if you could raise your hand online as well as in the room. Is there anyone from the audience that has any questions? Mike?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. So I'm just trying to, can you pull up the rec harvest table? Slide number 8. And I'll ask the question while I'm talking because you might not need to see. Yeah.
Stephen, can you go to slide 8? Oh, thank you.
So help me understand this table. Is the RHL overage for 2020 and 2021, is that attributed to the MRIP data change?
Yeah, so 2020 was the first year where we evaluated the RHL compared to the new MRIP estimates. So that's reflecting that change there. So any year prior to 2020 uses the old MRIP estimates.
Okay, but the RHL for those years is based on the assessment that incorporated the new MRIP data.
Yes.
Okay, thanks.
Anyone else from the audience here in the room? Okay, seeing none, I'm going to go to our participants online. James Fletcher. Go ahead, James.
Thank you. Hannah, I have asked in the past for the total number of pounds of imported tilapia that compete in this market share, and I know you're new coming into it, but in the future, could you bring in so the council can understand that this product competes with tilapia and the number of pounds that are being imported to take the market share? We need for the council to know how many pounds of imports are coming in. So in the future, would you please consider giving us a number for the total number of tilapia imports? Thank you.
All right, thanks, James. I'm looking down the table to staff to see if anybody has any comments on that. We don't have anything at this time, but we'll take that into consideration. Dewey Hemmelwright, back to the table.
Yeah, there's probably ways that if you look on import-export data into the U.S. that somebody could find that based on the species and frozen and where it's coming into the port of into the country. that could be found. There is a website that's pretty efficient on telling where port of entry is for different things and where stuff like that is. So that probably could be found with a little bit of digging.
Yeah, thanks, Dewey. We can consider that, and I'll look down at Hannah. She's nodding her head that she can maybe take a look at that. Thank you. Okay, we're back at the table now, seeing no other hands from the public. So next I have Tom Fody, Chris Bat-Savage, and then what I'd like to do is entertain a motion for the revised specifications that were presented by Hannah. So let's go to Tom first, and then Chris, you're up after Tom. Tom, go ahead.
Yeah, looking at these numbers, when I see that huge jump in the recreational catch by 98% and by 174% based on the revised MREP numbers, when the same happened in summer flounder, we basically said that we were underestimating the stocks, and then we gave a 49% increase to the commercial fishery. Was there any look at whether we were underestimating the stocks by us having such a big catch?
Hannah? Carson?
I'll jump in for this one. So when the new MREP data was incorporated into the Scop stock assessment, it didn't have the same effect on our understanding of the stock biomass that it had for summer flounder. And the MREP data wasn't as an important of an input into that stock assessment model. So it did, different assessments responded differently to the incorporation of that data set.
Okay, thanks, Carson. Thanks for the question, Tom. Chris Bat-Savage.
Thanks, Mr. Chair. I thought of a question when the public was speaking. Hannah, the 1-inch size limit increase for the recreational fishery this year, trying to remember, was that predicted to result in a 33% reduction? Okay, so I'm seeing head nodding. So how does that, I guess that compares, if you look at the harvest estimates for 2020 and 2021, taking that as a reduction, I guess that would be sort of in the range of what the RHL is for 2023, right? I mean, I guess 1 year might be above, 1 year might be below. Am I doing the math right on that?
Yeah, so I can't say for certain, but it would be more within the range compared to the past 2 years.
Okay, thanks, Chris. Okay, seeing no hands at this time, as I mentioned earlier, like we did with summer flounder, we have a staff recommendation, and which was supported by the monitoring committee, to move forward with revised 2023 specifications for Scop. And I would ask somebody, whoever's in control of the screen, to put the draft motion before the council and the board. And Joe Cimino, since you did such a wonderful job last time, would you mind making this motion on behalf of the board and the council and read it into the record for me, please?
Flattery, Mr. Chair. Happy to do it. On behalf of both the council and the board, move to revise the 2023 specification for Scop such that the commercial ACL equals ACT equal to 19.29 million pounds and the commercial quota equal to 14.01 million pounds. The recreational ACL equal to ACT at 10.39 million pounds and the RHL at 9.27 million pounds.
Okay, thanks, Joe. So Joe's making that motion on behalf of the council and the board. Do I have a second on behalf of the council? Pat Gear seconds that motion on behalf of the council, and Nicola Meserve seconding that motion on behalf of the board. Is there any discussion on the motion? Sarah?
I just wanted to note, we certainly support this motion as we did for summer flounder in the 2023 specifications. I did want to note just for the record and acknowledge that we have not yet approved the commercial and recreational allocation amendment. We're preparing the proposed rule for that action. So I just wanted to note that today that we support these recommendations as is, we support this motion. But just wanted to note that that proposed rule is in development and we have not approved the amendment yet.
Okay, thanks. I appreciate that, Sarah. Chris Batsavage?
Yeah, thank you, Mr. Chair. Yesterday, we discussed the Bluefish Monitoring Committee's recommendation to have a meeting next spring to talk about ways to come up with how to calculate management uncertainty for bluefish. And it was mentioned, it might be something for the Flounder, Scott, and Black Sea Bass Monitoring Committee to listen in on. If there's time and work schedules, I think it would be a worthwhile effort for that monitoring committee to have a similar meeting as the Bluefish Monitoring Committee to try to come up with a way to formally address monitoring management uncertainty, since it seems to kind of pop up from time to time and certainly is persistent right now with this motion, this fishery. But I mean, I could support the motion, but I'd feel a lot better if the monitoring committee could address that in the future. Thanks.
Yeah, I appreciate that, Chris, and we can take that under consideration as we plan both at the council and the board level for discussions in the spring. Not speaking for the board, but I assume that that's something that we can talk about. The second for the board was Nicola, right? Yeah. Nicola Meserve. Okay, is there any other discussion on the motion? Is there anyone from the audience here in the room? Seeing no hands, is there anyone online? Is there anyone on the telephone that can't raise their hand that would like to speak to the motion? Seeing and hearing no interest in that discussion, I'm going to turn the floor over to the board chair, Justin Davis, to call the question for the board, and then the council will follow. Justin?
Okay, thank you, Mr. Chair. So to the board, see if we can do this the easy way. Are there any objections to the motion? Please raise your hands. Okay, not seeing any hands, I'll ask if there are any abstentions. Okay, we have one abstention from Potomac River Fisheries Commission. So the motion passes the board by consent with one abstention.
Let me ask Tony Kearns, is that language okay there, Tony?
Should say unanimous consent with one abstention. I think it just helps us rectify if all the states voted.
Okay, thanks, Tony. All right, so the motion carries the board. Back to the council. Is there any objection to the motion by any member of the council? Seeing no objection, are there any abstentions? With no abstentions, the motion carries by unanimous consent. Thank you. Hannah, is there anything else that needs to come before the Scop or before the council or the board at this time?
No, not at this time.
Okay, well, thank you for your time and congratulations on your first presentation to the board and the council. It doesn't get easier than that. So just keep that in mind as you go forward. Things might get a little more challenging down the road, but you did a great job. Thank you very much. Okay, with that, we're going to go ahead and jump right into the next item on our agenda, which is the Black Sea Bass 2023 specifications. Julia Beatty with the council staff is here with us to provide us that presentation. So Julia, take your time, but whenever you're set up and ready to go, you can go ahead and get started.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Good afternoon, everybody. I'll start talking while Stephen pulls up the slides, but it's similar things as covered for the previous two species. See if the clicker's working. So it's all the same decision points in terms of considering revisions to all the catch and landings limits for 2023 for Black Sea Bass. Changes are needed due to the revised commercial and recreational allocations as discussed for the other two species. And then review the commercial management measures, decide if any changes to those are needed. That was not recommended by the monitoring committee. And then for black sea bass, we have additional considerations related to the February recreational fishery. And that's the only aspect of the recreational management measures that we need to talk about today for black sea bass, just because of the timing of that fishery, that if any changes are needed, those changes need to be made early enough that we can complete the rulemaking before February. So first I'll summarize stock status. So the most recent stock assessment information is still coming from the 2021 management track assessment, which included data through 2019. And it concluded that the stock is not overfished and overfishing was not occurring in 2019. Biomass was about double the target level, and fishing mortality was about 15% below FMSY. It's also worth noting that black sea bass is currently undergoing a research track assessment, which is tentatively scheduled for peer review in February. And we're anticipating getting a management track assessment in the summer of next year, which we'll use to set management measures for the next 2 years. I'm gonna take this off because I think I'm far away enough from all of you and it's kind of hard to breathe. All right, so this is the biomass and recruitment figure from the stock assessment. You can see that biomass is the solid red line. You can see it reached a peak a few years back, and it's been declining since then. And the horizontal dashed line is the target biomass level. But it's important to remember that for black sea bass, the stock assessment requires a retrospective adjustment, and that scales biomass up. And that adjustment was only made in the terminal year, so 2019. So that red circle is what we compare to the horizontal dashed line. So that's showing that biomass is about double the target level. And then recruitment, you can see in the bars, you can see peaks for the 2011 and 2015 year classes showing up 1 year later as age 1. And then again, the terminal year recruitment value is adjusted to that solid black square. This figure shows fishing mortality in the black squares compared to FMSY in the horizontal line. The retrospectively adjusted value is in red. So we're below that reference point, which is good. Overfishing is not occurring. So we did get a data update from the Science Center this year, which includes updates on landings, which I'll summarize in later slides. And it includes some updated information from the Science Center's spring bottom trawl survey. So for black sea bass, we focus on the spring bottom trawl survey because it's assumed to be a better index of the stock than the fall survey, because overwintering survival is very important for black sea bass. So the spring survey captures the fish that survived over the winter. So the top figure shows the relative index of abundance. You can see that it has generally increased pretty steadily since 2015. It's important to note that the 2020 index was based on an incomplete survey due to COVID issues. And then the bottom figure there is the age compositions from the spring bottom trawl survey. And both that and or the aggregate index are showing signs of above average year classes from 2011, 2015, 2016, and 2019. So the previous assessment didn't have an estimate of the strength of the 2019 year class. And so the fact that these surveys are showing signs of an above average year class in 2019 is, one additional piece of information that we didn't have before. So next I'll step through recent fishery landings and discards for the commercial and recreational fisheries. As with summer flounder and scup, we only have dead discard estimates through 2019. So keep that in mind when looking at the figure here that 2020 and 2021 are missing dead discards. So some noteworthy trends here. For the commercial fishery, the 2021 landings were a little bit higher than 2020, which puts them at the highest landings in the time series. And that's related to the quota increasing in recent years. For the recreational fishery, we also saw pretty high recreational landings in 2021. And I think it might be the second highest in the time series. It's pretty close to the estimate that we saw in 2016 and 2017 And if you probably remember for black sea bass, those were the years that the harvest estimates were deemed outliers. So next I'll step through how each fishery compared to their landings and catch limits. First, starting with the recreational fishery. And again, we have the situation where we need to do the comparison based on old MRIP data through 2019, and we can compare it to the new MRIP data starting in 2020, because that's the first year that the assessment incorporated the new MRIP data, and that we were able to use that information to set the catch and landings limits. So you can see that in terms of RHL overages, we did have some pretty notable RHL underages, either in years where we did not have RHL set based on an assessment. So that would be through 2017 through 2016. And then in 2020 and 2021, we see pretty notable RHL overages. The 2 years that the council and board agreed to leave the recreational measures unchanged, even though they were expected to result in RHL overages. That was the temporary status quo approach years, given the ongoing allocation amendment, the ongoing harvest control rule action, and a desire to kind of take a temporary status quo approach while some other management actions work their way through. And then restrictions were implemented in 2022 with the goal of preventing overages starting in 2022, but it's too early in the year to know how that has performed so far. You can also see some how catch has compared to the ACL. You can see that that's been kind of variable. And again, we don't have dead discard information for 2020 or 2021 at this point in time. This is the same table for the commercial fishery. You can see that the commercial fishery has not exceeded their quota in any of the years on the screen here. You'll also note that the quota increased by 59% from 2019 going into 2020, and there was a 23% underage in that year. So maybe that was partly due to the increase in the quota, but also, of course, that was the first major pandemic year that had big impacts on markets and demand. So maybe those two factors are playing together there. And we saw 20% underage of the quota in 2021. You'll also see ACL overages in all the years that are shown on the screen for which we have data. This was something that was been discussed in previous years, and the method for projecting dead discards was modified starting with the 2020 specifications in an attempt to address those overages. But again, we don't have dead discard estimates for those years yet, so we can't yet evaluate how well that change in the method actually succeeded in preventing ACL overages, but we did take steps to attempt to address those overages. This figure shows the commercial landings trajectory for this year in blue compared to last year in yellow, and you can see that it's on an extremely similar trajectory as last year. As of August 3rd, about 44% of the commercial quota has been landed. Again, we don't have really useful preliminary current year information for the recreational fishery because of the lag in getting the data through the MRIP program, and also for black sea bass, most states were closed through at least May 15th. So the information that we have right now doesn't really provide us much useful information for the recreational fishery for 2022. Next, I will summarize the advisory panel fishery performance report related to black sea bass, and everything that Kylie summarized under kind of general comments that applied to all three species also applies here. So everything that advisor said about high costs and some other things also apply to black sea bass. So in terms of black sea bass specific comments, one advisor said that the commercial ex-vessel price in New York has not fully recovered from COVID, and this is likely due to the important role of restaurants in the market for black sea bass in New York. Another advisor recommended a 7,500 pound federal waters commercial trip limit to help prevent large ITQ trips from negatively impacting the price for all vessels. So there's currently no federal waters commercial trip limit for black sea bass, but there are trip limits in several states, but not all states. So this advisor was discussing states that use ITQs. The vessels that have ITQs can land large amounts of black sea bass. And sometimes when they do that, that can cause the price to drop, and then that impacts everybody, not just the people who are fishing in the ITQ fishery. Multiple advisors said that availability to recreational anglers remains very high. I believe Kylie might have summarized comments that advisors had about there's reduced recreational fishing effort this year, generally due to high costs and other factors. One advisor said, even with that reduction in effort, those who are out fishing are doing very well with black sea bass. And I think it was the same advisor who also said that management will always struggle to constrain the recreational fishery when availability is so high. And we might continue to see overages this year, even with reduced effort because availability is so high. And this advisor also said that the fishery should be less restricted when biomass is high. Kind of along the same lines, one advisor talked about if we get in a situation where we need to reduce future harvest and result to past overages, that this can be counterproductive for abundant stocks, because if you're reducing the harvest on them, that'll just make them even more abundant, and then you'll continue to have more overages. One advisor said that with the more restrictive recreational measures that were implemented in 2022, I'm kind of skipping ahead. Just generally, this advisor was talking about minimum size limits generally. For black sea bass, they increased the harvest of male fish as opposed to other species like summer flounder, where there's concern about size limits increasing the harvest of female fish. This advisor said for black sea bass, if you're harvesting more of the male fish, this should not be overly detrimental to the stock. One advisor said that with the current high costs, for hire vessels may not be able to stay in business if the bag limit goes to 8 or lower, and especially considering that there's reduced availability of summer flounder. One advisor described an observation of a large female black sea bass that was on the order of 8 to 10 pounds. And this advisor asked, could black sea bass transition from female to male and then back to female? Because this advisor was not aware that female black sea bass could grow this large. So and there was an interesting discussion about sex change in black sea bass and what might be happening here. An additional advisor provided email comments due to technological difficulties connecting to the webinar. This advisor was not able to participate in the webinar. But in email comments, he said that the restrictions that were implemented in the recreational fishery in 2022 were a travesty because biomass is so high and the stock is doing so well. This advisor expressed concern about discard mortality with the increased minimum size limit that was implemented this year. He also said that recreational fishermen have noted that there's times when black sea bass are around, but they won't bite the hooks, and they don't have a good explanation for why this might be. And in terms of research recommendations, this advisor recommended more research into when, where, and the age of spawning. And then he asked when the fish are showing signs of lockjaw, is that related to spawning? And then he referenced kind of information about the changing distribution of the stock. And he questioned if in the future are any studies predicting that the stock will shift away from Delaware. So we took all that information to the SSC and asked them to review their previously recommended ABC for 2023, and they agreed that there was there was no information to suggest that the conditions had majorly changed compared to what they previously considered when they first recommended this ABC. So they agreed that no changes were necessary. The ABC is decreasing compared to 2022, just simply because of the declining biomass. So next, stepping through all the same flowchart steps that Hannah described for Scop, with the changes in the commercial recreational allocation, we now have a catch-based allocation for black sea bass, which means that we apply the allocation directly to the ABC to derive a commercial ACL and a recreational ACL. So this isn't really a decision point to make today. It's just applying these previously approved allocations to the ABC. So 45% commercial, 55% recreational gives us the ACLs shown on the screen here. And then the next decision, it relates to management uncertainty, and are the ACTs set less than or equal to the ACLs to account for management uncertainty? Similar to all the rationale described for Scop and also summer flounder, that the monitoring committee recommended no management uncertainty buffers in either sector. For the commercial fishery, as I showed on a previous slide, landings have not exceeded the quota for several years. We did have ACL overages in recent years that were due to discards. And like I said earlier, the discard projection method was modified starting with the 2021 specifications. So I believe I might have misspoken on a previous slide. 2021 was the first year that we implemented a change in terms of how we account for discards in the flowchart to derive the quota. So we're hoping that that helped address the pattern of overages due to discards that we saw in the past. So monitoring committee agreed that no additional management uncertainty buffer is needed there. In terms of the recreational fishery, like I said earlier, there were notable RHL overages in years where measures were either not set based on the stock assessment and under this special status quo approach that we had in 2020 and 2021. But measures were restricted in 2022, aiming to prevent a 2022 RHL overage. Next year will be the first year that we'll use the percent change approach. And as has been said a few times today, we don't know exactly what that will mean for black sea bass in terms of can the 2022 measures remain in place or will they need to be modified? And if so, what percentage change will they be aiming to achieve? Because it won't be until later in the fall that we'll be able to step through that percent change table to know what the outcome is. Under the percent change approach, we're no longer going to be trying to pinpoint an RHL. We'll be aiming for a different target. And it's hard to say right now how all of this will come together to help us know if we need an additional buffer between the ACL and the ACT. So given all that, monitoring committee recommended no management uncertainty buffer in the recreational fishery. So next we think about projected discards in the upcoming year and then subtract them from the ACTs to get the landings limits for each sector. So unlike for summer flounder and scup, the black sea bass stock assessment does not project the commercial fishery separate from the recreational fishery or discard separate from landings. So we need to do things a little bit differently for black sea bass compared to the other species just for that reason. So the method that was used for the 2021 and 2022 specifications, again, this method for black sea bass was a change from prior years in an attempt to address the past under prediction of discards. And what it does is it assumes that in each sector, dead discards as a proportion of total dead catch will be equal to the most recent 3-year average proportions. So it's kind of starting with sector-specific assumptions as opposed to starting with an assumption about total discards and then splitting it into commercial and recreational. It's just looking at, based on the most recent 3-year average of total dead catch in each sector, what proportion of that was discarded. And with the new catch-based allocation, it's really simple to just apply that. The math was more complicated under the landings-based allocation. So the monitoring committee talked about this in detail. They agreed that it was appropriate to continue using this same approach for the commercial fishery for 2023, but they did not reach a complete agreement on what to do for the recreational fishery. There we go. So for the recreational fishery, 7 monitoring committee members supported one method and 5 monitoring committee members supported another method. So because there wasn't like a strong consensus here, I'm going to summarize considerations related to both of these methods. And it did come down to voting to get these tallies, and just to note up front that there's multiple council staff and commission staff on the monitoring committee. For the purposes of voting, council staff counted as 1 vote and commission staff counted as 1 vote. So the method that was used in prior years is what's shown in green there. And then the black line with the black circles are the actual dead discard estimates from the Science Center. So again, we only have those through 2019. We treat those as the actual recreational dead discards. And unlike with bluefish, we haven't had a discussion of like multiple different potential methods for this. We've just been accepting the Science Center estimates that are used in the stock assessment. There hasn't been major issues with using those numbers in the past. So when we look at the black circles, that's what we're treating as our actual discards, and then comparing the blue triangles and the green circle to the values shown in black. Which method do we think is a better prediction of 2023 discards? One issue is, of course, that we don't have discard estimates beyond 2019. So that makes it a little challenging to compare these methods. And then the method shown in green, which is the method used for the previous 2 years, we did not calculate what that would have resulted in further back in time because like I said earlier, the math for how you do that is really challenging under the landings-based allocation. And it's a lot more simple under the catch-based allocation. So we didn't attempt to recreate that in the prior landings-based allocation years. So the alternative method is a simple 3-year average, which was supported by 7 monitoring committee members. That's just taking whatever the most recent 3-year average of the dead discard estimates are, just averaging that and using that as your assumed discards in the upcoming year. And next I will walk through kind of the more considerations for each approach. And I wanted to describe this in detail because again, it wasn't something that the monitoring committee was in complete agreement on. So if you use a simple 3-year average, you probably noticed on the previous slide that it's a higher estimate than the prior year's method. It's the monitoring committee members who spoke in favor of this said that it's more in line with the available time series of discard estimates than the prior year's method. And this kind of makes sense because it's just a 3-year average of what those estimates are. This also does not require an assumption that catch will be equal to the ACL because it's not trying to take a proportion and then apply it to the ACL. It's just saying, take the straight 3-year average. Some monitoring committee members had concerns related to an assumption that catch would be equal to the ACL for the recreational black sea bass fishery. Like I showed on a previous slide, there was some years of overages, some years of getting closer to the ACL for the recreational fishery. We don't know exactly what will happen, how close we'll be to the ACL next year under the percent change approach. So there was concern that if we underpredict discards, then that could increase the likelihood of ACL overage and therefore triggering an AM in a future year. So again, this method results in a higher discard estimate than the other method. One monitoring committee member said that although we don't have dead discard estimates available for 2020 or 2021, if you do a sort of back of the envelope approach and take the dead discards in numbers of fish and apply the average weight of discarded fish to that number, then you get about 3 million pounds, which is in line with this estimate. So a way to kind of fill in 1 year of the gap that we have right here. So the other method supported by 5 monitoring committee members was just to use the same method that was used in the prior 2 years for this species. Again, it's just taking a recent proportion of catch that was discarded and applying it to the ACL. Some monitoring committee members supported this because of consistency with the approach used in previous years, with the approach used for the commercial sector, and with the approach used for summer flounder and scup. It's not exactly the same as for summer flounder and scup, but it's very similar. One monitoring committee member noted that by this time next year, we'll get the next management track assessment update, and that will have 3 additional years of data compared to what we have available to us right now. So that will allow us to evaluate the performance of this method, which we really can't evaluate very well right now because we don't have dead discard estimates for the years that it's actually been used in so far. One monitoring committee member noted that although this method results in a lower discard estimate than the simple 3-year average, that it might be reasonable to assume that discards will be lower. And also the resulting estimate is lower than what discards were during 2015 through 2019. This monitoring committee member said that there was that noteworthy increase in the RHL in 2020 and 2021. So maybe discards would actually be lower. One monitoring committee member said that if we use a lower discard estimate, that can reduce the potential for a negative feedback loop, because if your discard projections are too high, that reduces the RHL, which can result in more restrictive measures, which can in turn result in more discards. So it's kind of like a self-fulfilling prophecy. So again, 5 monitoring committee members supported this method. 7 monitoring committee members supported a simple 3-year average. So this table shows the resulting catch and landings limits based on the method supported by the 7 monitoring committee members. I have a backup slide with the resulting values based on the other method. It's about a 1 million pound difference in the RHL, but besides that, everything else would be the same. All the commercial catch and landings limits would be the same. So the next topic is commercial management measures that can be modified through specifications. Short story is that the monitoring committee recommended no changes to these for 2023. Like I said earlier, one advisor recommended considering using a commercial possession limit in federal waters, but we haven't really done an analysis of that. Monitoring committee didn't recommend moving forward with that at this point in time. Kylie and Hannah also mentioned further considerations related to the potential for changing the minimum mesh size and considering if there should be a common mesh size across black sea bass, scup, and or summer flounder. But again, we haven't had time to make much progress on that, so that could be a priority for future years. So the last topic for black sea bass is the February recreational fishery, and kind of the backstory on why this change is needed is kind of complicated. So I thought I would start with the punchline here, which is that the monitoring committee recommends modifying the process for the February recreational fishery to state that vessels landing black sea bass in a state with approved Wave 1 recreational fishery are subject to the state regulations during that Wave 1 fishery. Under the current process, states must match the federal waters measures. So this would say instead of matching the federal measures, you would just be subject to the regulations of that Wave 1 fishery, which still needs to go through the process to get approved. And then we need, the monitoring committee agreed that a change would be needed here to make it so that the states don't need to match the federal waters measures here because of implications related to the process that we use to waive the federal waters measures for black sea bass, which was first used this year. So it wasn't really an issue for the February fishery before. And this mostly has implications for Virginia because this is a special February recreational opening that states have to opt into. And Virginia has expressed an interest in potentially participating in 2023. This opening has been allowed since 2018, and Virginia participated every year except for 2022 because of the restrictions that were implemented across the board in 2022. But they participated every other year, and they expressed an interest in retaining the ability to continue to participate in the future. North Carolina participated in earlier years, but my understanding is that they do not intend to continue to participate. And the monitoring committee has been very supportive of the way that Virginia has handled this fishery. And they recommended that if other states want to participate in this optional opening in the future, that those states should use a process that's similar to the way Virginia does it. So some key points related to the Virginia recreational fishery are that they have a permit that's specific to the February recreational fishery. So captains or operators of vessels have to have that permit to participate. This includes for both private and for hire trips. Vessels must hail, or permit holders must hail to the VMRC Marine Police Operations Station prior to or just after the start of each fishing trip. So they have a good handle on what trips are taking place. And for every trip, the permittees must report a variety of information, which is shown on the screen here, including the number of black sea bass that were kept and released. And the estimates of harvest that are generated through these reports are used to adjust Virginia's measures later in the year. So this is a really cool program where Virginia is really closely monitoring who's participating, how many trips they're taking, and they're accounting for the actual harvest within the same year to help ensure that participation in this optional opening doesn't increase harvest beyond the appropriate target level. So the monitoring committee has been very supportive of this way of doing things for this February fishery. So the issue here is that starting in 2022, the council and board are now making an annual decision between waiving coastwide measures and implementing one set of, between implementing one set of coastwide measures and waiving federal waters measures in favor of state measures. So this is the process that's been used for summer flounder for a long time, but it hasn't been used for black sea bass until 2022. And the waiving of federal waters measures does not roll over from one year to the next. It's a decision that needs to be made every year, and there needs to be rulemaking to make it happen. And usually that rulemaking is not completed until the spring, until after February. So that means that technically the non-preferred coastwide measures are the federal waters measures from January 1st until they are waived. And the non-preferred coastwide measures are a one-size-fits-all approach, and they're more restrictive than the measures in some states and some regions. So, for example, in Virginia, the measures that Virginia has during other times of year are not as restrictive as the current non-preferred coastwide measures. So the Virginia representative on the monitoring committee identified this as a barrier to continued participation in the February fishery for Virginia, because the measures that would technically be the federal waters measures in February are so restrictive. So the monitoring committee agreed that the way that Virginia handles this fishery, they're going to account for whatever they harvest anyway. So it shouldn't necessarily matter if their measures are more liberal than the non-preferred coastwide measures during February, because they're going to account for that. So to help simplify this whole process, it was kind of like a long backstory of this very simple recommendation to just change the February fishery process to say that instead of matching the federal waters measures, vessels landing black sea bass in a state with approved Wave 1 recreational fishery are subject to the state regulations during that Wave 1 fishery. And states that want to get their Wave 1 fisheries approved would still need to go through the process that involves review by the technical committee and approval by the board. And the monitoring committee has, clearly indicated that if you want to get an approved fishery, you would ideally do it very similar to how Virginia has handled it so far. So that was my last slide. And again, the decision points here are related to the 2023 ACLs, ACT, commercial quota, and RHL. Changes are needed due to the revised commercial and recreational allocations. And then again, there was a recommendation from 7 monitoring committee members to also change the way that we project recreational discards. No recommended changes to the commercial measures that can be changed through specifications. And then that one recommended tweak to how we do things for the February recreational fishery. And then with that, I'll take questions.
Okay, thanks, Julia. While people are thinking about questions, I wonder if you could provide us a thought about how we can make this more complicated. I'd be curious to your thoughts as to how we can just add one more thing to managing black sea bass that would complicate matters even more. So, all joking aside, are there any questions? I've got a couple hands. We'll start with Jason McNamee. Go ahead, Jason.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and I'll jump right to the discard discussion if that's okay. Maybe I'll start with kind of a simple question, and that is, what is our ability to potentially do an averaging of the two approaches?
Yeah, sorry, I had that on the slide, but I think I forgot to say it out loud. We could average the two approaches, and there was some discussion of that at the monitoring committee meeting, and 2 monitoring committee members said they wouldn't be opposed to that, but the other monitoring committee members said they would, they kind of stuck in their camps of one method or the other. But I think it's total. I personally think it's totally possible to average the 2 methods. It's all about what do we think is going to happen next year. There's no requirements to use a specific method, and it's always a big assumption anyway about what's going to happen in the future. So I think it's fair to consider averaging the 2 methods.
Go ahead, Jason.
Thanks, Mr. Chair. So I like that idea. I'm glad to hear that it's still a viable option, and I'll give a little bit of reasoning. And you have these sort of, it's almost an even split across the monitoring committee. It's not like it was a lopsided, a little bit more in one camp than the other. So in the, I guess, the way you characterize the averaging idea of not objecting is not a ringing endorsement necessarily, but maybe it was late in the meeting at that point. But it's just an opportunity. You have good arguments on both sides for both of the methods. And by averaging, it sort of mitigates the impact of being wrong one way or the other. You kind of, end up in the middle there. So if, the staff recommendation is too high, you're still maybe high with the averaging approach, but not as high, and vice versa for the other approach. So I kind of like the idea. We can make it sound fancier and call it an ensemble approach rather than averaging, but I'll just kind of leave that hanging out there for now as another potential option here for folks to think about. Thanks, Julia. Good job. The way you presented what I'm sure was a really complicated and long discussion was really, it helped me a lot. So thanks for that.
So you've done just what I asked, Jason, and made things more complicated. So thank you. Chris Bat-Savage, and then Nicola, you're up next.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. On the subject of discards and maybe complicating things. Early in the presentation, I think you said the Science Center, latest Science Center update indicates that of an above average or maybe strong year class in 2019 is expected. Was that, am I remember that correctly? Okay. If that's the case, I guess in 2023, will those fish be all legal size throughout the range of states, or will there still be a proportion of that year class that's below the minimum size?
Julian.
That's a good question, and I feel like I should always prepare for that question because it comes up a lot. But especially because the minimum size in the recreational fishery anyway increased in 2022. I might just as a guess, and maybe if there's anybody on the Science Center who wants to save me, I would guess that there might still be some of those fish that might still be below the recreational minimum size in some states, especially considering that the minimum size increased in the recreational fishery in a lot of states in 2022.
Chris.
Yeah, thanks for that, Julia. Yeah, I mean, I've raised that question, I think, just to keep in mind as far as what might be the most appropriate discard estimate assumption. If we think there's, a year class coming in that's been stronger than the last couple, and those fish, could be undersized in some states, or in some cases, just might be more of them. So you'll have, exceeding the bag limit. It's something for, I think, the board and council to think about as far as the appropriate discards estimate to apply to the recreational fishery next year. Thanks.
Okay, thanks, Chris. Nicola Meserve.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. My question has already been answered because it was the same as Dr. McNamee's actually. So I'm pleased to hear that answer. And was thinking along the lines of averaging the two approaches because the method that we picked for the current 2 years, we don't actually have any way to evaluate it yet because those discard estimates aren't available yet. So abandoning ship on it so soon gives me pause, particularly when I can point to several reasons that discards could be lower this year, including the declining biomass as well as the AP reported, reduced effort amidst record high inflation and gas prices. So I would be comfortable in support of a averaging approach as well. Thanks.
Okay, thanks, Nicola. Pat Gear.
Mine is more of a comment. I can wait till the questions are done.
Go ahead. You can make.
All right. I want to thank the monitoring committee and the board for considering Virginia's request. I know it's making it more making this whole process more complex, but our fishery in February has been very important to, especially to our charter captains, to our hire fleet, and some anglers as well. As Julia pointed out better than I ever could, it's like we monitor this fishery very closely. We know what it means to be, it's a privilege to have it open. It's, and we're willing to do what we have to do to keep that fishery going each year and pay back whatever we have to. One of the things that Julie did mention is that we require folks to call into our law enforcement so that we have a list of where people are coming into, what ports, so we can send our creel clerks there to get catch information and biological information as well. So that's it's not just self-reporting. We're actually going to the docks and, interviewing folks in the process as well. So I strongly hope that you support this measure as we move forward. So thank you.
Yeah, thanks, Pat. So that can be your rationale when I come to you in a few minutes about making a motion perhaps to revise or to modify the, Black Sea Bass recreational program as Julia mentioned earlier. So just keep that in mind as we go. I'll turn back to you in a little bit. Any other questions? I've got a couple hands. I'm going to go next to David Borden, and then I have John Clark after David. Go ahead, David.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I just wanted to ask, follow up on Chris's question. Will 2019 year class be recruiting to the commercial fishery next year, Julia?
I'm sorry, I wish I knew off the top of my head the age at which black sea bass are certain sizes, and the commercial fishery minimum size, I have it on the slide somewhere, I think it's 11 inches. I'm sorry, I just don't know off the top of my head at what age they would reach that size. So I could might be too late, but I could figure it out and get back to you all, but I'm sorry, I don't know that off the top of my head.
Thank you very much.
Okay, thank you. John Clark.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Thank you for the presentation, Julia. Just curious if any discussion came up with any of your panels or committees about the anomalous black sea bass catches in the southern part of the range last year. I know in Delaware, it was extraordinary. People were limiting out on, typically they'll limit out on black sea bass at the beginning of the season in May, and then it's mostly just small ones. You got to pick through a lot of small ones to get to your limit, but people limit it out during the entire season. We have a pot survey going on out there that's targeting structure-oriented fish, and it showed up in that also, and we didn't really see any connection to any obvious factors such as lower temperatures. And now this year, it seems like we're back to where we were in 2019, 2020, where, you know, we're already at the point where a lot of throwback black sea bass and not as many keepers. So I'm just curious whether it came up in the discussions as to, I know our harvest in Delaware last year was about 33% higher than the previous year. Thanks.
Julia.
I would say no, that didn't really come up. I mean, it was kind of noted that in general, coastwide recreational landings in 2021 were, you know, pretty high, almost 12 million pounds, compared to about 9 million in 2020. But there wasn't really like a in-depth discussion of those sorts of points that you made, or kind of really digging into any kind of specifics. So I would say generally, no, there wasn't really a big discussion of that.
Well, thanks, Julia. I'm just curious because I'm pretty sure, and Mike, you could back me on this. I think the same thing happened in Maryland and even Virginia last year.
Yeah, John, I couldn't tell I couldn't hear you very well. Was that a question for me?
Oh, I was just saying that I think can you hear me now?
Yeah, I can hear you a little better.
I think it was just anomalous in that it seemed to be the entire southern end of the black sea bass range just had tremendous recreational fishing success in 2021. I believe it was also Maryland and Virginia, not just Delaware.
Yeah, I would agree. That's the feedback that we got from some of the folks that did headboat work offshore. Looking over at Sonny, I think he's nodding his head that was the. So we agree, John. Thank you. Okay, I don't see any other hands from the board or the council at this time. Oh, Adam's hand just went up. So let me go to Adam, and then I'll turn to the audience for any questions to Julia. We'll come back to the table for decisions on how to move forward. Adam Nowalski.
I didn't have an additional question. If you'd like to go to the audience, I just wanted to let you know that I'm prepared with a motion when you're ready.
Okay, I'll come back to you, Adam. Let me go out to the audience. Is there anyone here in the audience that has any questions they'd like to ask of Julia based on the presentation? Mike Wayne?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Julia, I have a few questions on a couple different slides, Mr. Chairman, if that's right.
Sure.
So starting with slide 8, that's the rec table. So if I'm reading this correctly, there was ACL overages in 16, 17, and 18. And then can you go to the next slide? And for the commercial sector, there were ACL overages in 16, 17, 18, and 19. So slide 5 is the next one I want to look at. Okay, so just as a reminder, there were overages in both sectors of the ACL for 16, 17, and 18. And this figure is fishing mortality across that same time frame. And so I'm kind of struggling with the data tables that show ACL overages and these estimates of fishing mortality, which for the 20, is that 16 and 17 that are the lowest values of F in the time series, and yet the ACL overages were the highest. Is there an explanation for that?
Yeah, I'll just jump in. I don't know if there's like a, complete explanation, but I will say that for black sea bass, we do have this good retrospective pattern where we add more data to the assessment and biomass is even bigger than we thought it was before. So this is kind of an issue that we have with black sea bass sometimes, where we set an ABC, we exceed the ABC. You would think that that would cause negative impacts on the stock. We get a new assessment update and it says that like things are actually not that bad. So that could be something that's happening here is with the retrospective pattern. We have overages of these limits that were set based on the best information available at the time, and then we get new information and it didn't actually negatively impact the stock. But beyond that, if there's other things that are playing into the F there, I'm not sure I can speak to that, but I can just say like big picture, it could be related to the retro.
Go ahead, Mike.
Thanks. So just to confirm, these are realized F values from those years coming from the same assessment that creates the projections that produce the ABC and the ACLs, correct? And then one last question. For the overages that occurred for both sectors, the ACL overages, are the accountability measures the same for both sectors for the ACL overages, or are they different?
They are different depending on if it's a overage due to just landings or due to just discards. So I actually have a backup slide on the recreational ACLs where they vary based on stock status. So if there's an ACL overage, then you consider biomass compared to the target, and you take a more strict response if stock status is poor compared to if stock status is good. And that's regardless of if the overage was due, sorry, it must be like my last backup slide. There we go. And it's a wall of text, but so you take a more strict response if biomass is low compared to if biomass is high, which for black sea bass, we're in the high category, so we're at number 3. For the recreational fishery, regardless of if the ACL overage was due to landings or dead discards, when biomass is above the target, you just adjust the measures in a following year to try to prevent future overages. And the AMs for the commercial fishery are, if you have a quota overage, you pay that back. But if the overage was due to discards, then it's a similar process to what's shown on the slide here for the recreational fishery, that you're only doing a payback in situations where stock status is poor, and when stock status is good, and the overage was due to discards only on the commercial side, that you're not doing a payback similar to the recreational fishery. So there's some similarities and some differences depending on if the overage was due to discards or landings.
Sorry, Mr. Chairman, one more, just one more. Thank you.
That's fine.
So I'm trying to piece this all together. So we have ACL overages for both sectors, and yet the fishing mortality for that time frame appears as though there's no issue to stock status, yet there's still accountability measures based on those projections from the ACL overages? Meaning, does the realized fishing mortality play into the accountability measures at all?
No, under the changes that were made under the percent change approach, it will in one tiny aspect of the AMs, but essentially the answer is no, that we didn't change that aspect of the AMs, that we're not considering whether overfishing occurred or not, except for in this one specific instance in the recreational AMs, but like big picture, that doesn't come into play in the AMs.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
All right, thanks, Mike. And just so you know, you've used up all your questions for the week. So, Greg DiDomenico.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Greg DiDomenico. Just a quick question for Julia. Julia, refresh my memory. Were the commercial overages due to discards forgiven through Framework 13? Is that what that was? I'm trying to sit here and remember. I can't.
I don't know if I know the framework number off the top of my head, but there was a semi-recent framework that made the commercial discard overages treated in a similar way as the recreational overages, where stock status is considered, and you don't necessarily need to have like a payback response to commercial discard overages based on that framework.
Thank you.
Okay, thanks, Greg. Thanks, Julia. Okay, I want to come back to the table. Well, let me ask if anyone online has any questions from the public. Okay, I don't see any hands, and I think I may have already asked for that. So let's bring it back to the table, bring it back to the board and the council. I'm going to take Michelle's either question, comment, and then Adam, I'm going to come to you for a motion. Go ahead, Michelle.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Yeah, so this has to do sort of with the discussion that Mike Wayne and Julia were having. And, you know, it seems a little bit counterintuitive, but you know, unless you have an overage of the OFL, you would not necessarily expect that you are, you know, having a realized F that is above the threshold. So even though we've had ACL overages, and even though we do have a relatively small buffer between the, you know, the OFL and the ABC for black sea bass, just due to its stock status, unless that OFL was exceeded, you wouldn't necessarily expect that overfishing to occur. And, you know, those same projections, I mean, projections are used for the OFL as well as the ABC. So thanks.
Yeah, thanks for that, Michelle. That's helpful to give that some thought. Okay, as I mentioned, so we have a couple things before us. The first has to do with the setting of revised 2023 black sea bass specifications, and the difference in those specifications is all related to how discards are calculated and what the outcome is regarding the recreational harvest limit, which could swing about 1 million pounds based on the monitoring committee recommendation, the previous year's discards projected for both sectors, or the averaging approach. So that's where we stand, and that's what I'd like to take up at this time. So I'm going to come to Adam. Adam, do you have a motion for us?
Yeah, thank you very much. Before I make that motion, let me preface the comments that I intended to come here today and speak in favor of the discard approach of consistency with what we've been doing. I think the monitoring committee members who made that argument, I sat through the monitoring committee meeting, made a very good case for it. And I think I'll always err on the side of consistency when given different approaches. I think that we're seeing some changes in the fishery, not necessarily in abundance, but certainly with regards to the number of things that are ongoing that may affect the number of people that are fishing. I think those monitoring committee members that spoke in favor of the revised approach did make a very good case. And after reading the monitoring committee document, I had my mind somewhat changed by that. And I think I'm willing to today offer that compromise position that you've heard talked about that would split the two approaches. So staff has either of the two motions that can go with, and I'm going to modify that with the compromise RHL, which will be 6.57 million pounds. So if staff could put that up, I'll go ahead and read it into the record. I'll be making this motion on behalf of the council. Mr. Chairman, you'll need someone to make it for the board. Move to revise the 2023 Black Sea Bass specifications such that the recreational ACL equals ACT equals 9.16 million pounds and the RHL equals 6.57 million pounds. The commercial ACL equals ACT equals 7.5 million pounds and the commercial quota equals 4.8 million pounds. Thank you.
Okay, thank you, Adam. So we have a motion on behalf of the council. I need a second from the council. Joe Semino will second that on behalf of the council. And from the board, do I have somebody who would like to make that motion? Nicola, your hand's up. You're making that motion, Nicola? Okay. Can I get a second on that, Joe Semino? Second that motion on behalf of the board. We have a motion now before us for discussion. Nicola, Adam already provided rationale. Did you want to add to your thoughts on that before I turn to Joe?
I think I'm good, Mr. Chairman. I already spoke to it earlier and Adam really covered all the bases. Thank you.
Okay, thanks, Nicola. Joe, did you have anything to add? Okay, Joe shaking his head no. Nothing to add on that. So let me turn to the council and the board at this time. Is there any discussion on this motion? Sarah?
I'd like to maybe go back to the rationale. There was good discussion prior to this motion being presented, and there were several points raised by many different council and board members to the different approaches that you can use for calculating discards. I think with the motion on the board, it would be really helpful to summarize the rationale specific to this motion. Particularly, this is moving away from what came out of the monitoring committee, the staff recommendation. So it's really important that the rationale is clear with respect to this motion, given it is a departure from what was previously recommended and discussed.
Okay, I'll go to Adam as maker of the motion from the council. If he wants to add any additional rationale. Adam?
Sure. So I think with regards to the comment that it's moving away from what was recommended, I'm not really sure that that's the case. The monitoring committee discussion was pretty much equally split. In fact, as I recall the discussion, those that spoke in favor of the consistent approach that we had been using most recently, at the time of the call, I believe there was a majority in favor. We allowed for some deference to some additional email discussion prior to the final report coming out. So I'm not sure that I would characterize that monitoring committee report as being in any way overwhelming. I think it was pretty evenly split, and I think that that's good rationale because there was good points raised on both sides, that the consistent approach would have erred, in my opinion, on the side of the lower discards. I think this is a fair compromise that reflects what we're seeing on the water moving forward, where I think it's reasonable to expect as we move forward, discards may not be as high as they've been. You've heard some of those indicators here today, some declining biomass. Certainly, we know that effort this year is going to be affected by fuel prices and other economic factors. So I think it's a reasonable middle ground to go with this approach. And again, I would not characterize it as going against the monitoring committee. And I think the staff memo also laid out some rationale. While ultimately staff recommended the simple 3-year average, they did lay out in the document discussion about what that 2.14 million pound number had been used previously and why it had been used previously. Hope that's helpful to the service moving forward.
Guess we'll find out, Adam. Thank you, if this moves forward. And thank you for that additional rationale. I've got a few hands in front of me right now. I'm going to go next to Chris Batsavage, and then I'll go to Emerson after Chris. Go ahead, Chris.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Yeah, trying to estimate discards for black sea bass, be it commercial, recreational, has probably been one of the bigger challenges that we've had. Yeah, I understand the rationale for the approach in this motion, but I don't think I can support it. I think some cases can be made. The discards can be more in the range of what staff recommended and the majority of the monitoring committee expected it to be in 2023. And kind of speaking to that, yeah, I think it appears that effort might be a little lower this year with the high gas prices and inflation. We don't know what 2023 is going to bring. In fact, with gas prices dropping, effort could go up later this year. So that's just predicting future output of the recreational fisheries, a tough one as well. That we've heard about just higher than expected catches in certain parts of the range in the last year or so. I think with that there's as many reasons for either, but I prefer to err on the side of a higher discard estimate. I'm not going to make a substitute motion, but just want to state that I cannot support the motion that's on the board. Thanks.
Okay, thanks, Chris. Emerson Hasbrook.
Yeah, thank you, Mr. Chairman. I just want to verify either with the maker of the motion or with council staff that those specifications for the recreational fishery incorporate the average between those two methods that were discussed about estimating the recreational discards.
I calculated it separately and got the same value that Adam got. So the only difference between any of the motions that might come up with this format is in the RHL, and the 6.57 million pounds matches my calculations as well for the average of those two methods.
Yeah, thank you. So in that case, I can support the motion.
Okay, thanks, Emerson. Jason McNamee.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. And I just wanted to chime in on the question from Sarah or Garfo. And second, everything that Adam said, I thought those are really good points. And the only one I will add to it is one of the difficulties the monitoring committee had was this inability to kind of ground truth the method and sort of check back to do some comparative work. And so I think that's why we ended up with the staff recommended alternative approach, was because of that. And so I just wanted to add, there was difficulties in doing some of the kind of fundamental analyses, which is why we ended up with two approaches in the first place. And then I'll also just point out, I guess we call that lack of objection rather than support for the averaging, but this notion of averaging did come up in their discussion as well. So I just wanted to add to what Adam offered. Thanks.
Thanks, Jason. I appreciate that for the record. I'm going to go next to Michelle Duvall. Emerson, I see your hand still up. I'll come back to you if you have a follow-up, but let me go to Michelle first.
Yeah, thank you, Mr. Chairman. I mean, I came into this meeting sort of thinking on the opposite side of what Adam had expressed, that, when looking at the graph that has been provided at the monitoring committee meeting, and hearing the discussion, that, there was a lot more, I would say,
consistency, at least with the calculation and just having a concern about underestimating discards. And, I think maintaining, what's used in the assessment and, seeing the pretty big gap between, the method that we implemented for 2021 and 2022 and, what the previous discard calculations have been. It is certainly imperfect, but, I think I can support this. Others have made good points with respect to the effort on the water this year, as well as declining biomass. So I'm noting my concern for the record, but, saying that I'm willing to do this for 2023.
I appreciate that, Michelle. Thank you. Is there anyone else from the board or the council that has any comments to the motion before us? Dewey Hemmelwright.
Given yesterday Adam's comments, the accountability of the recreational industry, putting it to bid, I could support this for 2023.
Okay, thanks, Dewey. Okay, I don't see any other hands either online or in the room at this time, so I'm going to go out to the audience. Is there anyone from the public that would like to provide any comment regarding the motion before us? Seeing no hands in the audience, is there anyone online participating virtually or on the phone that would like to offer any comment? Okay, seeing nothing at this time, let me ask before I call the question. I think the council's up first this time, but I'm going to ask, does the board need an opportunity to caucus on this one? If anyone, either here in the room or online, would like 2 minutes to caucus, that somebody just raise their hand and will allow that to happen. Okay. Mr. Chairman, I don't see any hands, so I assume that a caucus is not necessary at this time. So I'm going to read the motion into the record, and then I'll call the question first of the council, and then I'll turn it over to Justin to call the question on the board. The motion is move to revise the 2023 Black Sea Bass specifications such that the recreational ACL equals ACT equals 9.16 million pounds and the RHL equals 6.57 million pounds. The commercial ACL equals ACT equals 7.50 million pounds, and the commercial quota equals 4.80 million pounds. All those members of the council that support the motion, please indicate by showing your hand. Online would be best. And I'll read. I don't know if you can do that, Dewey, but if not, we'll count you. Dewey Hemmelwright is supporting, but his computer's acting up. Give me a second to count the votes. Okay, I got 7. Let me try again. Shelley, Shelley's hand's up. Oh, okay. Okay. So Shelley's Dewey. Okay, we got that. And I see that Ingrid with Potomac River Fisheries Commission has raised. Ingrid, this vote is for the council members only at this time. So, okay, let me recount and then we'll move on. So I've got Tom, Chris, Shelley Dewey, Sonny, Kate, Michelle, Skip, Dan, Sarah, David Stormer, Peter Hughes, John Maniscalco, Pat Gear, Paul Reese, Joe Semino, Adam Nowalski. Did anyone? That's a count of 16. sorry. Yeah. Okay, so we had a count of 16 in favor. If you can put your hands down. Okay, seeing no hands, all that are opposed, please raise your hand. Okay, I have Wes Townsend, Chris Bat Savage in opposition. So that's 2 in opposition. Please lower your hands. Are there any abstentions? Sarah Bland or Garfo abstains. So the motion carries 16 to 2 to 1. And I'm going to turn the mic over to Justin Davis to call the question on behalf of the board. Justin.
Okay, thank you, Mr. Chairman. So since we're actually going to take yeses and nos on this one, Tony, before I start, just wanted to clarify, would we like folks to raise their hands on the webinar, or should we do a mix of in the room and on the webinar? Or?
However you want to do it, Mr. Chairman, I can handle both.
Okay, why don't we have folks raise their hands on the webinar with the caveat that I don't have a device, so I'll be doing it the good old fashioned way for Connecticut and putting my hand in the air. All right, so for all those members of the board who are in favor of the motion, please signify by raising your hand virtually on the webinar.
Just let me, the hand settle, I'll read the state names out. Please do not lower your hand on the webinar until I'm finished. I have Massachusetts, Virginia, Rhode Island, Delaware, New York, New Jersey, New Hampshire, Maryland, Connecticut, and Potomac River Fisheries Commission. And lower the hands.
Okay, all those members of the board opposed to the motion, same sign.
I have North Carolina.
Okay, any null votes? Please raise your hand.
I have no hands.
And any abstentions?
Is no Fisheries going to vote? No Fisheries is abstaining. It wasn't showing up.
Okay, thank you. So the motion carries the board, 10 in favor, 1 opposed, no null votes, 1 abstention.
Okay, thanks, Justin. So that concludes our business regarding 2023 specifications. We do have the issue that Julia mentioned and provided us some information on regarding the February Black Sea Bass recreational opening process. And there was a suggestion for a revision or a modification to that opening process that I'd like to see if anyone around the table would like to make that motion based on staff's recommendation. Pat? Okay, we're going to bring that up. Would you like to read that into the record for me?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Move to modify the February Black Sea Bass recreational opening process to specify that vessels landing Black Sea Bass in a state with an approved Wave 1 recreational fishery are subject to the state regulations during that Wave 1 fishery.
Okay, thanks, Pat. So I'm assuming you'll make that on behalf of the board as well?
Yes, sir.
Okay. Can I ask for a second on behalf of the council? Skip Feller, and for the board? Tom Foti. Okay, so we have a motion. Is there any discussion on the motion? Pat has already provided rationale behind Virginia's interest in moving forward with this, and I believe Julia did a nice job explaining why this modification would be necessary to reduce complications, which is not typical of the work we do on Black Sea Bass, but it's a good thing. I certainly support it. So let me see if there's any discussion on this motion. Pat, your hands up. Did you want to leave that up or? Okay, Joe Semino?
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I support the concept. I guess I'm just trying to understand. So this is a recommendation for something that would occur in federal waters and can be done in time? I guess that's a question. Partly for process and then maybe even for Garfield. So.
Yeah, I would try to explain it, I think, but I'd mess it up. Maybe Julia can provide her thoughts.
Yeah, there's time to make this change and time for it to impact next year's February fishery.
Okay, that was easy enough. I probably could have done that. Okay, is there any other discussion on the motion? All right, seeing none, is there anyone from the public in the audience here today, or anyone online from the public that would like to make a comment? Okay, seeing no hands at this time, I'm going to turn things over to Justin to call the question on behalf of the board. Justin.
Okay, thank you, Mr. Chairman. So to the board, are there any objections to the motion? Okay, not seeing any hands, I'll ask if there are any abstentions. Okay, we have one abstention from the service. So the motion passes by unanimous consent with one abstention.
Okay, thanks, Justin. I'm going to ask the council the same question. Are there any objections to the motion? Seeing no objections to this motion, I assume there's one abstention. Ms. Bland? Okay, the motion carries the council by unanimous consent with one abstention by Garfo. Julia, is there anything else that we need to cover today regarding black sea bass?
Nope, that's all for this agenda item.
Okay, thank you very much for your time preparing the materials for this discussion. Just want to thank you for that. So that concludes our business today as a joint body between the council and ASMFC's Summer Flounder Scop Black Sea Bass Board. So at this time, I'm going to adjourn the meeting. And as I mentioned earlier, there will be a board-only session for Summer Flounder Scop Black Sea Bass Fishery Management Plan Review for members of the board only. So why don't we take a 5-10 minute, take a 5-minute break, come on back at 3:30 and we'll take up the board action. Chris is asking me to remind everyone that he will be hosting hospitality this evening as soon as he gets to his room 230. And see you all there tonight. Thank you. See you back here in 5 minutes.
Just testing my audio. Can anyone hear me?
I can hear you. Can you hear me?
Yeah, good to go. All right, perfect. Thanks.
Stephen, if you're there, can I go ahead and share my screen? This is Tracy.
Hi, folks. I think we're going to try to go ahead and come back to the table here for the Summer Flounder, Scup, and Black Sea Bass Board. Okay, thank you, everyone. So appreciate the board sticking around for some extra innings here to take care of one bit of board-only business. And that is going to be Black Sea Bass Fishery Management Plan review of the 2021 fishing year. So to start off here, we're going to have some presentations from commission staff, Dustin Colson-Leaning and Tracy Bauer, who are going to be presenting remotely. So I'll go ahead and hand it off to Dustin and Tracy.
Thanks, Mr. Chair. Hi, everyone. Sorry I couldn't be there in person. So today we're going to pretty much give you an abbreviated overview of the fishery management plans for scup, summer flounder, and black sea bass, given that Kylie, Hannah, and Julia covered them. A lot of the information that's usually in the FMP reviews pretty thoroughly earlier today. So we're not going to rehash anything, but get right to the point of the PRT recommendations. So starting off with black sea bass, as usual, there were no de minimis requests. The PRT found one inconsistency among the states regarding the black sea bass FMP. They noted that Connecticut's regulations do not appear to include the requirement of 2 escape vents in the parlor portion of the trap. This is the first time this has been noticed, but otherwise the PRT determined all states have implemented regulations consistent with the FMP requirements. Otherwise, on a more minor note, the PRT made the following recommendations to improve compliance reports. So the PRT, when providing regulations, state compliance reports should highlight in some way that the portions that apply to black sea bass, specifically if the regulations encompass multiple species. Also, pots and traps should be separated from other types of gear in the commercial harvest by gear tables included in the compliance reports. So that's it for black sea bass. I'm going to hand it over to Dustin to take care of summer flounder and scup.
Thanks, Tracy. And so it's pretty much the same. I'll be just covering PRT comments and recommendations for both summer flounder and scup. So Tracy, you can actually skip ahead 2 slides here. So the PRT did note that New Jersey and Delaware do not have in place regulations prohibiting transfers at sea. This also isn't the first time that the PRT has made note of this. New Jersey has indicated that they're working through the regulatory package process, and that this time next year, it should show that the regulatory package has gone through and the regulation is in place. So the PRT did not flag this as a big concern. Delaware, as this had been flagged last year, does not have this prohibition of transfers at sea, but it does maintain a commercial possession limit of only 4 fish for summer flounder, as well as the fact that it's also a de minimis commercial fishery, meaning it has less than 0.1% of coast-wide landings year over year and has for many years. So this had been given as a reason to not have the prohibition of transfers at sea. However, the PRT thought it would be worth flagging here again, acknowledging that the policy board has also been working through standardizing de minimis status for all fisheries. And so it would be within the board's purview to potentially make prohibition of transfers at sea one of the regulatory items that could be excused if a state achieves de minimis status. However, there could be some implications. Oh, sorry, excuse me, I can't speak, rolling over my tongue here. Implications of having federal permit holders also fishing within state waters. So there may be some challenges there. It may not be advisable, but perhaps this should be taken up at another time, discussing the potential complications of not putting this into place in state waters in Delaware specifically. So at least at this stage, it may be worth a wait and see what the policy board comes up with, and at some point discuss whether this regulation should be added under the de minimis status. So for now, it's just kind of a flag this. If the board would like to discuss it here, that's fine. If we'd like to wait until later action to kind of see if we're given greater direction from the policy board, that's also fine. Next slide, please. So once again, Delaware has requested de minimis status and meets the requirements for 2021. And aside from those two issues that I noted on the previous slide, the PRT determined that all states have implemented regulations consistent with FMP requirements. So this was a pretty standard compliance review this year, especially given that there weren't that many changes to specific regulations. Next slide, please. So I'll cover Scop. I thought Hannah did a great job providing a great overview of what's been going on with the fishery and stock status and so on. So I'll get right down to the PRT compliance comments. So Delaware, again, has been flagged in this instance for Scop in that it doesn't have pot and trap escape vent regulations that are consistent with the Scop FMP. Within the Scop fishery, for pot and trap escape vents, they're required to be at least 2.5 inches, 2.25 inches in length for square rectangular vents and degradable fasteners. But Delaware's regulations have a vent size of 2.5 inches in diameter, or square vent sides of 2 inches. So essentially, their vent sizes are just a little bit larger and are in compliance with the black sea bass pot and trap escape vent requirements. When this was brought up with Delaware staff last year, they noted that they really don't have a directed fishery and they have very minimal landings of Scop, and they were concerned about this regulation kind of interfering with other regulations that they have for their pot and lobster, lobster pots, and decided actually against implementing this more restrictive measure. Next slide. So once again, the PRT didn't highlight Delaware's escape vent issue as a high priority issue, given its de minimis status, as well as the fact that it has very minimal landings year over year. So the PRT actually recommends that Delaware be exempted from the Scop escape vent requirement, so long as Delaware can demonstrate during the annual compliance review that they continue to have no directed Scop fishery with minimal landings year over year. The current threshold, of course, is 0.1% of annual coastwide landings, and they fall well below that. So the PRT is recommending just an annual review to make sure that this isn't like a biological concern. Next slide. So with that one exception noted, the PRT determined that all states have implemented regulations consistent with FMP requirements. And again, Delaware has requested de minimis status and meets the requirements for 2021. So with that, Tracy and I are happy to take any questions. We also do have a draft motion prepared should the board choose to proceed with the approval of the FMP reviews, state compliance, and de minimis requests. So at this time, next slide, we're just really considering approval or disapproval of the FMP reviews and state compliance reports. Thanks.
Okay, thank you, Dustin and Tracy, for those presentations. And I misspoke at the beginning of the meeting. We are not just doing FMP review for black sea bass here. We are, in fact, doing all three species. I'm going to go ahead and blame that on the fact I got stuck in a 90-degree train car for 2 hours yesterday on the way down here, and I don't think I've fully recovered yet. So at this point, I'll turn it back to the board and ask if there are any questions or discussion relative to the presentations. Jason McNamee, go ahead.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Just a question on the escape vent stuff. So I wonder, while I'm in agreement that for the fisheries that we were talking about directly, there's probably not an issue. But are there potential issues for other species that are harvested with pots in those states? And so I don't know if you can answer that, Dustin or Tracy, directly, but I'm wondering if the PRT discussed that and if they found that to also not be an issue.
Thanks, Jason. And Dustin and Tracy, I'll turn to you to see if you want to take a shot at answering that.
Yeah, so Jason, are you saying, is there a concern for bycatch of other species that this potential leniency could cause problems for other fisheries?
Yeah, either bycatch or, is it creating a loophole? If they're fishing for black sea bass with incorrect escape fence, can they say, oh, no, it's a scup pot? That kind of a thing.
Yeah, so that was discussed. We definitely don't want to, promote loopholes in any sense. And so one proposed solution was to update Delaware's regulations so that they make it clear that if you're targeting scup, you have to have that specific vent size. But it gets really tricky with enforcement. Like how do you designate what is a scup pot versus a black sea bass pot versus a lobster pot? So that's why we really looked towards the landings that occur year after year, and the fact that there really doesn't appear to be any directed fishery with landings well below 100 pounds in most years. So that was kind of the angle that we took, but it is a concern. And so if the board feels strongly about the potential for a loophole, that would definitely be worth discussing.
Thanks. I think I'm good, Mr. Chair. Thank you.
Okay, next up we have Roy Miller. Roy, go ahead.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Regarding de minimis standards, last week in our discussion of de minimis, we noted the wording that de minimis standards would have a negligible effect on the conservation of a species. Therefore, those states should not have to change regulations year to year to meet FMP requirements. Each FMP will establish a set of measures for de minimis states to implement that would not have to change year to year. I just like to, and these measures will provide a minimum level of the species conservation as well as prevent regulatory loopholes. I'd just like to remind the board that our draft de minimis guidance says measures will would provide a minimal level of species conservation. I would submit that Delaware's existing pot escape vents provide a minimum level of support. So one could argue the necessity of making changes, of making Delaware go through the regulatory process for this, but I don't think the vote is going to fail today on the basis of this, and it'll be up to the state of Delaware whether it's worth their while to pursue regulatory change just to satisfy this particular standard. I think I'll just let it go at that. Thanks.
Okay, thank you, Roy, for that input. I'm going to go ahead and move next to John Clark.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and just to elaborate a little more on what Roy just said, we're not being scofflaws here in the fabulous first state. I just want to point out also that our black sea bass fishery is commercial black sea bass fishery is entirely in federal waters. The permittees that we have that fish out there obviously have to have their federal permits. They are complying with all the federal regs, and I don't see, again, we don't have a scup quota. We don't really see them very often down here. And just clarification on the flounder, we're de minimis. The 4 fish per day is for those who have commercial hook and line licenses. They're held to our recreational limits, but we also do have some summer flounder catch that comes in as bycatch in our gillnet fishery, but as you've seen the records, it's a very, very small amount. So just wanted to add those clarifications. Thank you.
Okay, thank you, John. Next up, I have David Borden.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I just wanted to follow up on Jason's point about the escape vents. I would advance the thought that I think there's some confusion on the water about what vents need to be required under what circumstances. And I think some of that confusion also applies to the way the law is applied by enforcement officers. So my suggestion is at some point in the future, have some group review it and see if it's standardized first, and see whether or not it needs to be adjusted. Thank you.
Okay, thank you, Dave. And that's a good thought. And I'll look to Tony to see if that's the sort of thing we could run by the law enforcement committee at some point.
Yes, we can ask the law enforcement committee. I think this is exactly some of the issues that I was trying to point out to the policy board, in that when you have a joint plan and having de minimis measures, but the federal fishery not recognizing any de minimis measures, it makes it difficult to determine if things are consistent or inconsistent with the plan. And because Scop and black sea bass pots do not have tags, you can't specifically identify it as a law enforcement officer what type of pot that is unless directly asked. A lobster pot obviously has a tag on it. You can identify what that pot is. So it is a difficult issue to completely address. I think as we fully flesh out the de minimis policy at the policy board level, it will come back to this species board on whether or not we want to apply that de minimis policy to this FMP, because it is a joint plan and federal waters, or the federal fishery, does not recognize de minimis at all. It is not in the federal plan.
Okay, thanks, Tony. It sounds like this is something we'll continue to discuss as we develop that de minimis guidance. So at this point, I'm not seeing any additional hands. And so Mike Louisi sitting next. Oh, sorry. Go ahead. Tom Foti.
Yeah, the thing I was thinking about, if they're not catching scub and they put a small event, that means that smaller sea bass will be stuck in the pot where they could have escaped. I think that's one of the justifications for not putting in the smaller vent.
Thank you, Tom. So at this point, I'm not seeing any additional hands for comments or discussion. So I think we'd be ready to entertain a motion to approve FMP reviews, and Mike Louisi has put his hand up saying he'd be willing to make that motion. So if staff could put it up on the board, and there we go. Mike, if you'd be willing, go ahead and read the motion into the record.
Of course. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Motion is moved to approve the summer flounder, scup, and black sea bass FMP reviews for the 2021 fishing year, state compliance reports, and de minimis requests from Delaware for summer flounder and scup.
Okay, thank you, Mike. And I'm seeing a second from Nicola Meserve.
Hi, sorry, I'm having some technical difficulties in which it's not letting me type. Okay.
Okay, at this point, I'll ask if there is any discussion on the motion. Okay, not seeing any hands. I'll go ahead and call the question. I'll ask, oh, sorry, go ahead, Eric, and see you.
Yeah, thank you, Mr. Chairman. Yeah, I couldn't decide whether I wanted to comment. As far as Delaware goes, I don't have any real problem with it. I'm certainly not going to oppose this motion, but me personally, I'm going to abstain because I think there's more work to be done. So no offense, Delaware, but I'm going to abstain.
Okay, thanks, Eric. So I'll look again to the board to see if there's any additional hands for comments or discussion on the motion. Jason McNamee?
If I could, I just want to check in with David Borden, if we could have a minute to caucus.
Sure. Okay, so before we call the question, provide 2 minutes for caucus. All right, great. Thank you. Okay, so we'll bring the question back to the board. At this point, I'll ask if there are any objections to the motion. Please raise your hand if you object to the motion. I'm not seeing any hands. I'll ask if there are any abstentions. One abstention from Garfo. So the motion passes the board by unanimous consent with one abstention. Okay, is there any more business to come before this board today? Not seeing any takers. So with that, we'll stand adjourned. Thanks, everybody. Safe travels.